understood truth. So Wittgenstein uses the notion of a tautology. That is true. He does in the Tractatus. And instead of laws of logic, now he doesn't use the phrase laws of logic much. I think I found it once in one place, maybe twice here and there. But he doesn't use it much. He tends to use the phrase logic of the world. Now we should not read too much into this phrase. It's very obvious. If there is a logic, it is a logic about the world, right? I mean, just in a vacuous sense, it is about the world. What else can it be about? So, in that sense, it's a law of logic and a logic of the world. There is nothing we should read more seriously into it. So, this idea helps with the inference part. Interestingly, if you look at the earlier ideas, logical form and logical analysis, they help with the mirroring part first, and the inference part is problematic. Here we have the inference part immediately. Why? Because logic is just, tautologies. What else? So these tautologies help you do gapless proofs. They help you move from one step to another step. You use modus ponens, do all kinds of things, modus tollens, deductive syllogism. You use many, many rules, and you go from one step to another step. So it helps you with inference straight away. How does it help with mirroring? So here's where the problem lies. This is the best idea we have, and I think there's some textual support for it. But how can it possibly help with mirroring? So tautologists say nothing. That's very obvious, and this is an idea made famous by Wittgenstein. He's probably the first person to make this idea so famous that tautologists say nothing. And as all of you know, he reduces mathematics to some sort of tautological structure, and so therefore mathematical equations essentially say nothing. Indeed, he also thinks that mathematical equations reveal the logic of the world because they also say nothing. So tautologists say nothing. So how can they mirror the world or be the logic of the world, as 6.22 states? So 6.22 actually says this, that the logic of the world is revealed by tautologies. But how is that possible? And how can something that says nothing be a mirror image of the world? If you really think, what does a mirror do? It sort of reflects what is there in the world. But the tautology doesn't say anything. If it doesn't say anything, how can it reveal any structure in the world? That just doesn't make any sense if you think about it commonsensically. And Wittgenstein is not thinking non-commonsensically here. He's trying to express an idea which is reasonably familiar. So as I said before, he's not speaking metaphorically. He's not trying to make some very deep statement, which is, you have to really work very hard to figure out. No, he really wants you to understand something in a very simple sense. But I have found it very difficult to understand it. It's very clear to me it's not metaphorical, but it is very difficult to understand this. So here goes. Here is one way to figure out how the laws of truth, the tautologies, mirror the world. The first thing we have to understand is that the world exists in logical space. He says this right on either the first page or the second page of the Tractatus. He says this. He says the world exists in logical space. That means all the facts or the propositions, they all exist in logical space. They don't exist in physical space. Or physical space, if you have some statements about it, they also exist in logical space. So all those facts exist in logical space. Right, so now tautologies may say nothing. That is true, they say nothing, but they do not lack sense. Wittgenstein says that there is a difference between a tautology and a philosophical statement. A philosophical statement is ungrammatical or it violates some rule of ideal language or whatever. But a tautology, it has sense. It's not that it doesn't reach out to the world and say anything, but it does have sense. It doesn't lack sense. And this is there is a fair amount of commentary on this actually. How is it possible that a tautology can have sense, even though it says nothing? Philosophical statements are nonsensical because, well, there are many problems with them, grammatical, whatever. And but the tautologies also should be nonsensical. But they are not nonsensical. On the contrary, they have sense, and they don't say anything, but they do have sense. So they are necessary truths, and hence are not true about the world. Yeah, they are not, because the world contains everything that is accidental. Everything is contingent in the world. Everything is accidental. So they don't state anything about the world at all. Right. So how is it possible that they're mirroring anything? All right. So, but they're having sense without saying anything. This is my idea. This is something that Wittgenstein doesn't say. So I am trying to now connect the inferential role with the mirroring role. So they are having sense without saying anything, prepares the ground for sense-making statements. So this is where we turn metaphorical, unfortunately, yeah. So in a sense, logic is the ground of mirroring the world. The tautologies draw a boundary to logical space, leaving the contingent propositions to fill out that space. What happens is that the tautologies, because they have sense, but they say nothing, So, in a sense, they are the last outpost of sense. Anything inside it would reveal the structure of the world. Nothing lies outside it. So, it is the first post of transcendentalism, so to speak. I'll come back to this notion of transcendental. I think it's a bothersome notion, but it's just like you set a boundary to something, and whatever happens inside it, that is accidental. The boundary itself is necessary. That's the idea he's trying to express. He expresses it in a sort of odd way. What he really should have said was that logic is the ground of mirroring the world. It is not in itself the mirror image of the world, but it is the ground of mirroring the world. Uh, Here you will see that the notion of logical form, which I had brought out earlier, the first alternative that I had, that is a little bit better because it matches the mirroring role much better than this idea that I am presenting. But unfortunately, that doesn't match the inferential role that better. This idea matches the inferential role perfectly, but it doesn't match the mirroring role that perfectly. We have to go a little bit metaphorical, but not much. So we say that logic is the ground of mirroring the world. The tautologists draw a boundary to logical space. Remember, all the facts are in logical space. So the tautologists draw a boundary to it. Everything inside it is accidental. There's nothing outside it, and the boundary itself is necessary. So nothing can be thought outside that boundary. Everything can be thought inside that boundary. But there is nothing beyond that boundary. There is nothing there at all. So, I mean, when you say ethics and aesthetics are transcendental, it means that such facts are not there in the world. That's all. Uh, uh, but when you say logic is transcendental, that's a little bit different. So anyway, so the tautologists draw a boundary to logical space, leaving the contingent propositions to fill out that space. So the space is entirely filled out by contingent propositions. The boundary is made up of tautologies. So the sense, they have sense, but they say nothing. So it's the logical limit of sense, so to speak. Anything inside that limit is something that says, and it can be true or false, whatever. Tautologies can only be true. There are, of course, contradictions that are false. So, and he has much to say about tautologies and contradictions, which people often don't pay attention to, but I think they should. I mean, I think he says things that are very important about tautologies and contradictions. But anyway, let me go on. So, I think that it is the laws of truth that unite the ideas of mirroring with inference, which proves to be closest to capturing the idea that Wittgenstein has. It shows that all that Wittgenstein did was add the notion of mirroring to Frege's ideas about logic, hence keeping close to Frege, but also departing from Frege in a crucial respect, because Wittgenstein has other problems to handle. Like Frege is not, he's not trying to solve all the problems of philosophy or anything. He has nothing like this in his mind. So Wittgenstein has the task in his mind. He wants to draw a boundary to thinking, and which basically means he wants to draw a boundary to sense. And so in drawing the boundary to sense, what you do is you do logic and you get tautologies. Those tautologies are all necessary. They say nothing, but they do have sense. So it's a limiting case of sense. Once I have hit the limiting case of sense, I have essentially drawn the boundary to the world, so to speak, the boundary of thought. And anything inside that's true or false, it's a contingent statement. The boundary is basically just the tautologies. So that's why he says logic is the scaffolding of the world. The world stands and falls with logic, so to speak. And so that's why it's a mirror image of the world. But it's a mirror image in an odd sense. It's like the grounding of the mirroring of the world. The mirroring will take place. Logical form is possible. Why? Because logic is there. It's not because logical form is there, the logic is there. No, it's because logic is there, the logical form is there. So that's why I think logical form can't be the right idea of mirroring and inference. And logical analysis, well, that's, it could be in the picture, but I really don't. That's a pretty weak idea. It's this idea, the one that I thought was actually the last thing that would be true. This is the idea that actually turns out to be true. There is one small problem in this. I do not know when Frege expressed the thought. I know I said he expressed it in 1918, but whether he expressed this before in publication or in a class or somewhere, that's not known to me. And so where Wittgenstein may have picked up this idea is somewhat unclear to me, because I don't know whether he had read the thought, or I pretty much doubted that he had read it. So Wittgenstein was in a war at that time, right? So, and he was in prison for a while. So I really doubt whether he had reading material and things like that. I really doubt that. So there is this interesting problem here that where did he get this idea of the laws of truth? Well, he doesn't actually. So he just speaks of tautologies. So I am imposing this idea on him. But it just marries very nicely with Frege's idea that logic is essentially the laws of truth. They are just tautologies. and this is what you do. What Wittgenstein adds to this is the mirroring aspect, which he thinks is a very key aspect about logic. I will again emphasize that when we teach logic and when we learn logic and when we read logic on our own, we never think it's a mirror of the world. So when Wittgenstein says this, it should strike us as something very unusual. He's not speaking metaphorically. I will again repeat this. He's not speaking metaphorically. He wants us to understand this just like we understand that logic is about good and bad arguments. He wants us to understand that in exactly the same way. Nothing in the tractatus says that one sentence is more important or more primary or anything. Nothing. All of them have the same status in some sense. So he wants to draw a boundary to sense, and that boundary is very beautifully drawn by tautologies. They say nothing, but they have sense. So it's a limiting case of sense. It's a very simple idea. Anything that falls within, that's just a contingent statement that are true or false. So essentially, logic. If logic did not exist, well, it would be very strange. We would not be able to say anything sensible about the world, because the whole notion of sense is must generate the notion that there is a limiting case of sense. That's the fundamental idea of the Tractatus, that the very idea of meaning must be such that there is a limiting idea of meaning, such that I will be able to draw the boundary to thought. That's an absolutely fundamental idea of the Tractatus. Therefore, when he says logic is a mirror image of the world, that's one of the most fundamental statements of the Tractatus. He's essentially saying that because there are tautologies, that is why you are able to say anything about the world. Logical form trades on tautologies. I mean the logical form of contingent statements. Right. So, oh yeah, right. He also says logic is transcendental. Well, it is not transcendental in the same sense that ethics and aesthetics are. You might remember he also says that ethics is transcendental, aesthetics is transcendental. And logic, I think Wittgenstein was very famous at one time for saying that logic, ethics, and aesthetics are the same subject. Well, he didn't say it in the Tractatus. He sort of, I think he's speaking to Moore or Russell or somebody. So he says that there was a time when I actually believed this. Well, I'm not sure whether I believe it now, but I'm not sure what that statement means. When you are young, you kind of understand statements more easily than when you are older. So I kind of understood that statement a long time back, but now I don't. But I don't think that logic is transcendental in the same sense that ethics and aesthetics are transcendental. I'm not sure in what sense ethics and aesthetics are transcendental. If they are just simple philosophical statements, then they make grammatical errors, and so therefore they lack sense. But tautologies don't lack sense, and so therefore they are a limiting case of sense. Ethics and ethical and aesthetical statements are not limiting cases of sense, and so therefore they are very different from in a sense they are actually outside the boundary of tautologies, and so they are transcendental in a second sense. Logic is transcendental in a first degree sense. Ethics and aesthetics are transcendental in a second degree sense. They are more transcendental than logic. If anything can be more transcendental than logic. But anyway, so there are elements of metaphor that are involved in mirroring that are hard to remove. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I have found it very hard to do this. It's possible it can be done. I'm not saying that it is not possible to do it, but it's possible that it can be done. But it will require much more work. So I think it is important to search for the connection between mirroring and inference. Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to this idea right now that we say that logic is about inference and whatever. But why does Wittgenstein say it is a mirror image of the world? I mean, what is the need for him to say this? As I said, he wants to have a boundary to sense, but well, he could have done that inside. Essentially, he's done it already in the first half of the book. He's done it really. It's not necessary for him to go and say logic is a mirror image of the world or logic is a scaffolding of the world. He doesn't really have to say all this. If you really think about it for a while, why does he have to say all this? He's done all the work that he has to do in the saying, showing distinction. All that work is already done in some sense. And so he's again doing that work in a different way in the sort of the second half of the book, if it has a second half. It doesn't have a second half, but the book is very disjointed. It begins here, then it starts there, then it goes back to some other topic, then it comes back to somewhere else. It's kind of put together in a very strange way, but there's probably no better way to put it. I don't think there's any better way to put it. So he put it the best way he could, and it's just what we have with us. It's very difficult to make any immediate unitary sense out of all the stuff that he says in it. But I think it is important to connect these two notions of mirroring and inference, because Wittgenstein's book is essentially a book about logic. It's a book in philosophy of logic. And what's the substance, the sum, the motivation for philosophy of logic? It's inference. It's about structure of language. Why are you interested in the structure of language? Because you want your inferences to be going. Yeah, of course, you have other access to grind. So you have metaphysical access to grind essentially, and you may have grammatical access to grind. But if you have all of these access to grind, that's all very fine. But there's one axe you don't want to grind, and that is the axe of mirroring the world. That's one axe you don't want to grind. So if Wittgenstein is saying logic is a mirror image of the world, we've got to take that very seriously because he knows all that stuff very well as to what people want people to do with logic. What do we want people to do in logic? He knows that very well. So if he's adding this sentence, he clearly thinks this is absolutely fundamental to the nature of logic. Yet, in a sense, we have lost connection with this Tractarian picture of logic. We have retained the inferential picture, and it is very powerful. It is there in our teaching, in our learning. When we read books in logic, it's always there. But we have not retained, and we have retained the metaphysical picture, by the way. It's not like we have jettisoned that. Today, metaphysics is done very heavily. We have retained that metaphysical picture, but we have not retained this idea that logic is a mirror image of the world. Does this idea need this idea that logic draws a boundary to sense? Well, maybe it does, or maybe it is independent of it. If it does not need this idea, then yeah, we can jettison the idea. And maybe that's the reason why we jettisoned the idea and we kept the inferential idea. But that would show that inferentialism is inherently and fundamental to the nature of logic. But at least at the time that the Tractatus is being written, we have this very interesting picture of logic with us, where it is a mirror image of the world. It allows sentences or propositions to say anything about the world, precisely because it is a limiting case of having sense but not saying anything. So every other thing which is not a tautology and not a contradiction is able to say anything about the world, precisely because there are these limiting cases of senses. If you don't have any limiting case of sense, well, then it's very difficult to say what we are doing in logic, because we still have tautologies with us. So they are a limiting case of sense. It's just that the notion of a sense has separated itself from logic. I could say that maybe, and that's the reason why we don't have this attractive picture of mirroring and inference today with us that Wittgenstein had with him. So, but I think that if you have to make some sense of the Tractatus, there's ideas about logic. There are different ideas about inference, as I said before, and there is a lot of literature on that. But if you have to make some sense of the notion of logic that he has, we have to connect the notion of mirroring and inference. And I think that these notions can be connected just by looking at tautologies, which sounds very strange, but I think that's the only way to. It has some textual support to it. It's like, I mean, if you look at the specific line where he says logic is a mirror image of the world, it's not a body of doctrine. If you look above and below, he's essentially discussing inferences, and he's talking about tautologies and what that tautologies, the process and result are the same thing in logic. What is a proof? This that. So he's basically discussing logical stuff in there, and so he's discussing tautologies. He also discusses tautologies at a slightly different area of the book, a portion of the book. So there are different versions of the manner in which he discusses tautologies, but since he's discussing tautologies there, one would imagine that that's what he's talking about when he talks about logic being a mirror of the world. So that's all I had to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhowmick, for sharing your wonderful insights with us. I request our chairperson, Professor Pradhan, to give his reflections and comments on the same, and after that, we'll open the floor for questions. Over to you, Professor Pradhan.
Okay, thank you, Ankita, for your kind invitation to speak first. Dr. Bhowmick has presented a very lucid account of Wittgenstein's concept of logic, uh, and he has raised certain fundamental questions which are very, very important for understanding Wittgenstein's conception of logic. He started with the idea that logic is generally understood as a theory of inference, but Wittgenstein is adding the idea of logic as the mirror of the world. And initially, he finds a difficulty in combining the two, how logic as a theory of inference can also be a mirror image of the world. So he finds both are perhaps not going together. But happily, towards the end of his lecture, he found the connection. And that is what I think he has come to the right point in the Tractatus, because that is what Wittgenstein calls the decisive point in 6.24. This is a decisive point. And Dr. Bhowmick has rightly pointed out it is the tautology which holds the key to the whole idea of mirror of the world. So let us see why he really uh, wanted to emphasize the mirror image aspect of logic rather than the inference aspect. Though he has written much about inference in the Tractatus, out of which the notion of tautology really comes. So inference is there, but for Wittgenstein's own uh, understanding, logic was not confined only to the inferences, because it has to say something about the world. That was his point. Not that he was denying Frege, as Dr. Bhowmick has rightly pointed out. He, in fact, takes Frege into account. The laws of truth, in fact, they are especially the tautology in the Tractatus. So if laws of truth can hold some promise regarding the mirror image aspect of logic, then that will be the best that Wittgenstein could have done. Uh, his suggestion that Wittgenstein's suggestion that logic is transcendental is not to mystify the word transcendental, and Wittgenstein is very clear that if the idea of mirror image has to really make sense, then logic cannot do it unless it is fundamentally different from any other sciences about the world. So it has to be transcendental. Transcendental, as Dr. Bhowmick also rightly pointed out, that it is more concerned with the grounding of the notion of mirror. It is more concerned with the limiting sense, the notion of sense which the contingent propositions have is possible if there is a limit sense which is explained by logic. So in that sense, the notion of transcendental can make sense. When Dr. Bhowmick says that ethics is also transcendental and ethics and aesthetics are one for him, he never stressed this to say that logic and aesthetics are one. He never said this, not in the written form. So in the notebooks where he says ethics doesn't treat of the world, it is a condition of the world like logic. So if logic is a condition of the world, then ethics is also a condition of the world, but from two different perspectives. So in that sense, logic and ethics cannot be one. Both have different aspects of revealing the sense of the world. So in that sense, if the notion of good will be central to ethics, then notion of truth will be central to logic. So both have to be kept separate. Another point which Dr. Bhowmick has touched on is how to explain the marriage between inference and mirror image. Though he has rightly pointed out that it is a tautology which holds the key, exactly that has to be hammered more and more, because in the tautologies he finds a whole realm of truths, a whole realm of new sense which logic will express, not the sense of the contingent propositions, a whole realm of truth which logic will explain. So in that sense, Dr. Bhowmick is right in saying that laws of truth really hold the key to tautology, to the mirror image of the world. Now, the mirror image is not definitely a metaphor, because he means something exactly logical or exactly specific about the notion of mirror. That means there must be somewhere uh, where some place where logic can tell how the propositions which logic deals with, their interconnections, their inferential connections, that must be rooted somewhere in the exact relation between language and reality, or language and the world. And that is why he introduces the notion of elementary propositions or propositions as such. Once you introduce the notion of propositions, then elementary propositions will come, and so forth. But the notion of proposition itself as a picture of reality or picture of a fact is central to the whole understanding of logic, because logic alone tells us what a proposition does. So it is logic's responsibility, therefore, to lay down the conditions under which a proposition becomes true or false. Though logic is a bystander only, it is an observer. Logic is not doing any factual job. It is not relating any particular proposition with a particular fact. That is not its job. And Dr. Bhowmick is right. Logic is doing something global, something extraordinary. Therefore, is something transcendental. It is more an observer outside the world and looking at the world as it goes on, as it is constituted. That's why somewhere Wittgenstein writes in the Tractatus, logic pervades the world. That pervades itself is not metaphor. It is exactly, it covers the entire world through its own mechanism of truth conditions. So in that sense, there is nothing that which slips out of the grip of logic in the world. That's why he says that in logic everything is essential, necessary. So in that sense, though the world is contingent, but nothing in the world can slip out of the net of logic, because logic imposes that scaffolding on which the world stands. And I appreciate Dr. Bhowmick's idea that if logic falls, then the world also falls. That means logic is hinging on, or is hinged on, the scaffolding, which is logic itself. So this scaffolding is something so important, and therefore Wittgenstein calls it logic is a scaffolding of the world. And there its transcendentality lies, and there also lies its cruciality to understanding the world. That is, it is fundamental to understand the world. It is fundamental to take logic to understand the world. Mere science will not do. Mere any factual description of the world will not do. That is the job of science. But logic has a different different has a different task. That's why he is giving so much importance to logic. And the entire book is about logic and its metaphysical consequences about the world. So in a sense, I think we have listened to a very enlightening talk on the nature of logic, though initially Dr. Bhowmick has raised questions a bit pessimistically. Perhaps Wittgenstein has hidden, his ideas are more hidden than exposed, but ultimately he has conceded that Wittgenstein has not hidden anything. He has made it very explicit that logic is laying down the boundary of the world. It does describe or does fix or determine the boundary of the world, and therefore boundary of sense. And in that sense, logic has a great role to play in Tractatus. So the mere idea of logic as inference will not do, and that is perhaps a textbook idea of logic. But Wittgenstein doesn't write a textbook way of treating logic. He gives more importance and depth to this idea, which perhaps Russell could not appreciate, because Russell thought he is mystifying logic. And Frege, of course, said he didn't understand a word of Tractatus. That was his humility, but that was also the way of showing that Wittgenstein has gone beyond him. That is, Frege, very good. He laid the foundation of logic, but Wittgenstein made it much more philosophically important, to not only to understand the logical truth, but also to understand the world. This is something extraordinary, which as Wittgenstein has added to the whole study of logic. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your reflections. The floor is now open for questions.
Namaskar, Professor Pradhan sir, and
Namaskar,
namaskar
namaskar.
everybody. Well, certain doubts have come to my mind, but I'm not sure whether this house will accept my views on this. And what are things that I have got? I got from his lecture when he says logic deals with tautologies, number one, and he says tautologies say nothing. If we combine these two, we come to a position where we say logic says nothing, isn't it? So is that the case? Number one. Number two, when we say logic deals with tautologies, I think it is a one-sided way. I'm not hitting it with this line or something like it's my observations. Logic has to do with tautologies, contradictions, and the contingencies. What is logic after all if it cannot deal with the world? So if when well one thing I would take from Dr. Bhowmick is well the tautologies define the logical space and within that the contingent world has to be filled in. So if that is the case, the contradictions and the contingencies do fall within the purview of logic. Otherwise we'll say that logic says nothing. But when I say when what does it mean when I say logic says nothing? Here nothing is not a void. Nothing is here rather here I wish to say when logic says nothing, it is saying everything. It is defining the structure of a valid form of argumentation. So this is one observation. And the other thing, when he draws a parallel between, tries to draw a parallel between inference and mirroring, when we talk of inference, we are concerned with the form. Okay, there the subject matter may not enter into discourse. But when we talk of mirroring, the subject matter has to enter. So it is this, in this sense, we can draw a distinction between what is inferring and what is mirroring. But when you talk of mirroring, the subject matter has to enter in. So without the subject matter, well, even in picture theory, when we talk of, if we take extend this to picture theory, well, Wittgenstein clearly draws a parallel between the language on one side and the world on the other side. So by taking say when I say a pen, I see when I utter a word pen, I see a pen outside. When I say this is a pen, I draw a elementary proposition, this is a pen, and basing on that, I pointed a pen to show there is a pen. So based on these such simple statements, we generate the complex world. So and these complex statements reflect the whole of the world. So this is how a mirroring happens. And mirroring, if at all we are talking of mirroring, we cannot draw we cannot equate it with inference, because inference can go on with a form without involving the subject matter. But mirroring has to involve subject matter in some form or the other. I mean, it has to involve the contingencies of the world while living within the boundaries as defined by the logical space of the tautologies. Thank you, sir. I don't know whether I'm right or wrong, but this is what I learned from your lecture. So a bit of clarification, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, that's those are interesting observations. The first thing that you said is that does saying all the things that I said mean that logic says nothing? Well, yeah, actually, logic does say nothing. If you kind of put it together, I mean, tautologies don't say anything, so they have no. I mean, they have sense, but they don't say anything at all. So that's something that Wittgenstein is very famous about. So if logic is just about tautologies, and it's simply the laws of truth and nothing else, then yeah, that is true. Logic doesn't say anything. There's nothing to be surprised by it. I mean, it's just a subject that studies something in such a way such that there's no subject matter. So since there is no subject matter, I mean, Wittgenstein is very clear about this. He says that logic does not have a subject matter. If it doesn't have a subject matter, it doesn't say anything. It doesn't really follow that if something doesn't have a subject matter, it doesn't say anything. But he seems to think that that's what the case is. So the issue arises: how is it possible that it's a mirror image of the world? And so there we are basically trying to say that, well, logic is it's a limiting case of sense and this and that. So yeah, that's there. One thing that you said was that how that the mirroring and the inference are two different things. Yes and no. Well, yes, because it strikes you as different when you read it. But you see, logic, the aspects of logic are such that they are all connected to each other. Logic is just one thing. And so it's not like it has these properties that are independent of each other. That would be very strange actually if that were the case. All the properties of logic should be such that they are connected to each other in some logical sense. So mirroring must be connected to the inferential thing. Of course, when you do inferences, you're doing something completely different from say mirroring. Or mirroring is something you never do actually. It's not like actively you're doing mirroring. Whenever you do logic, if you are ever doing it, you just do mirroring as well. It just happens without your doing anything else. I mean, there's nothing extra you have to do mirroring. All you do is logic, and the mirroring happens by itself. One doesn't really have to do anything actually to do mirroring. Or if you, as long as you speak a language and the language is about the world, the mirroring happens on its own. But here, the mirroring that he's speaking of is the ground of the mirroring, not the actual mirroring from logical form. The actual mirroring of logical form is allowed by the limiting case of sense. When we have the notion of, yeah, you are actually right. I should have talked about contradictions. There, you're very right. So you said that you just spoke of tautologies, but you didn't speak of contradictions, and well, you spoke of contingency, but you didn't speak about contradictions. That's right. I didn't speak about it because I wasn't very confident what Wittgenstein had to say about contradictions. He does say much about tautologies and contradictions somewhere in the middle of the book, but that deserves a different talk. What his conception of the way it orders logical space, tautologies and contradictions, he has a certain opinion about that. And but that deserves a different talk. I'm not very confident about his the full role he gives to contradictions, and he does give them a full role. It's not that he doesn't give them a full role, but I'm not very confident about it. But I know that it doesn't affect what I've said about mirroring and inference. It doesn't affect that in any way.
Um, just a clarification, Nilanjan. One is about the concept of thought and how we think logically, and we cannot think illogical. Our thoughts are always logical in nature. Um, I mean, whether that is something to do with the Fregean concept of thought. Do you think? I mean, you pointed out that he was not aware of Frege's concept of thought. Um, Maybe that may be right, but when he tries to relate logic and thought together, um, do you think that he was I mean, that may be one of the examples where he was deeply concerned with the nature of thought. um, Seriously, can we say that?
Yes, you're right. As a matter of fact, Frege does say at one place, I think in the thought itself, the article, he does say that you can't have an illogical, you can't have a thought which breaks the laws of logic. He doesn't say an illogical thought. He says you can't have a thought that is that breaks the laws of truth, so to speak. So Wittgenstein does say in the Tractatus, he says that you can't have an illogical thought, that it is impossible. So maybe this is what he means by it, that you can't have a thought which breaks the laws of logic. So yeah, all right, that's fine. But I'm not sure what he means by this. In a sense, it is true that you can't have a. Well, I can always have a thought which says that I don't believe in any of the laws of logic, but I can always have such a thought. But that doesn't break any law of logic. I mean, that is still bound within the laws of how a language is constructed, how what thought I can express. So it's not very clear to me what would it mean to say that I have an illogical thought. What's an example of an illogical thought? If I can't think of any thought which is outside logic,
Mhm.
then it would be very strange to say that I can't think illogically. Because what is it to think illogically? There is no example of this at all. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure what Wittgenstein is aiming at. I can understand what Frege is saying. Maybe what Frege is saying is that if you entertain a contradiction, then that's not a thought. If I say Professor Pradhan is sitting here and I say Professor Pradhan is not sitting here at the same time, that according to Frege would not be a thought because it breaks the laws of truth.
Mm.
and so therefore it is not a thought. Whether Wittgenstein is saying the same thing when he says it is nobody can entertain an illogical thought. Is he saying the same thing or is he saying something different from Frege? Here there is some confusion in my mind. Maybe it is very easy to say, yeah, he's saying the same thing. But with Wittgenstein, there is a kind of difference with both Frege and Russell in the book. It's very clear that he is different from Frege and Russell. So if he is saying that you can't have an illogical thought, we also have to see at what specific place in the Tractatus he says this. I remember he says this somewhere in the middle of the Tractatus. He says this that you can't have an illogical thought at all. So there, we have to see at what context he is speaking. Is he speaking in the context of laws of logic? I don't remember this actually, whether he's speaking in the context of logic. I think he says it slightly somewhere else. So we will have to see what exactly he means by this. If he might mean the same thing that Frege says, but it is possible that he means something slightly different from what Frege means. He could mean something a bit more radical actually, that you simply cannot think a contradiction. When Frege might say you can think a contradiction, but it's just pseudo thought. It's really not a thought. But Wittgenstein might say that you can't even think a contradiction. The very notion of a contradiction will never arise in your mind. That idea might be there in Wittgenstein. So that's not correct because he does say that the contradictions are expressed in logic and all that. So yeah, that's there. It's difficult to say what he means by saying you can't think a single illogical thought.
Uh,
Sir, again a bit of clarification, sir. Well, I may be wrong. While listening to your response on the illogical thought, so when we say we think logically, or when we say we speak logically, so speaking logically or thinking logically is to hit at a tautology, because that is the form under which we have to deal a particular case or a particular aspect of the contingent world. Okay, so when I say I'm illogical, that means I am not hitting at a tautology, because a valid argument finally has to fall down at a tautology. It can never be a contradiction. It cannot be a contingent statement either. So finally, if we are in the binary logic, it has to come out as 1 1 1 1. So that is a tautology. That defines a tautology. So whatever we think, whatever we speak, that we say is logical, it has to hit at a tautology. So tautology, as you say, it that defines the boundary for the thinking, for a logical thinking to be possible. The way Kant even says that for say when Kant speaks of the categories of understanding, anything beyond the categories cannot be structured to the mind. So in the same way, tautologies define the space within the boundaries of which we can have a valid thinking. So it is the valid thinking finally that counts. Okay, and if that is if the valid thinking that counts, that has to end up as a tautology. So this is my position. I don't know how far I am correct or wrong. I don't know, sir. Your observation, sir.
No, what you have said is right. Yeah, that's right. But Wittgenstein has a very clear position on. He does say that we can think of contradictions. It's not that we can't think of them. And he has a certain place for contradictions within the logical space, so to speak. So he does spend some time talking about tautologies and contradictions at a very critical juncture in the Tractatus. It's not like he says that we can't think about contradictions. So what exactly he means by saying I don't think he's when he says I can't think of an illogical thought, he doesn't mean to say that I can only think of tautologies. Of course not. I can think of there's a seminar going on here. That's a thought. It's not a tautology. So what he means is something different. That is that we can't. Maybe he just wants to say that we can't think ungrammatically, so to speak, because grammar and logic to some extent are the same thing for him. So maybe he just means to say that an ungrammatical thought is not a thought. That is true. I mean, I agree with that. Yeah, that's right. I think Vikrant has a question.
Vikrant, you yes, Vikrant.
Yes, yes. That's a great question actually, because I mean I can put a Zeno type form to this. So you remember Zeno had once said that the tortoise is running ahead and Achilles is running behind the tortoise. So because tortoise keeps going ahead, Achilles has to keep catching up with him and he never catches up. So something like a Zeno type thing can be put on this. What you are saying is that look, in logic I am doing inferences, 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 and so when is an inference a justification? That's one way of asking the question that you're asking. I think you're asking something else also. But that's a great question actually. When, let us say I have done a derivation. I do a derivation. I do tautology, whatever. I do modus ponens, all kinds of things. When is that a justification of the conclusion? What is it that tells me that this proof is actually right and that I have done something, I am absolutely justified in believing the conclusion. Does the inference need me to believe that? Is there something else involved in it? Is there maybe some understanding of the inference going on in the human mind that does the job of justification? And what's this understanding element in it? Is justification the same as the inference, or is it something else that we are also putting an interpretation of that inference? So that's the idea. How many inferences do you have to do to get justified? Or is there any way I can ever get to do all the hundreds of inferences I do and ever feel justified about anything? Or is justification something extra? Of course, now any reductionist would immediately say, no, there is the justification is not extra. It is because the moment you say justification is extra, you are in big trouble. So you have to say that no, no. If you just do the inference, you do modus ponens, whatever massive deduction you do, and that's it. That's the justification of the conclusion. I'm not sure. I mean, it doesn't sound. It seems to me that a little bit of extra work will have to be done to show that that inference that we have done is also a justification of the conclusion. It should be, but a little bit more philosophical work needs to be done to see that. Because we need to have a theory of justification which delivers the idea that inferences are indeed justifying of the conclusion. That idea cannot come from a theory of inference itself. A theory of inference simply tells you these are inferences. Here's the right inference, here's the wrong one. We need a theory of justification which tells us that the inferences that you make are such that when the right inference comes along, that's actually a justifying inference. For that, you need a theory of justification. And I don't think anybody says that a theory of inference is also a theory of justification. For that, I need a meta theory of justification and inference. But whatever, I mean, yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure whether the theory of justification and the theory of inference are the same thing. Because the theory of inference is a theory of logic, whereas the theory of justification is a theory of epistemology. So I may do all the inferences in the world, and somebody, Professor Panda, can come and say, I don't believe this inference you have done. आपने इतना you so many inferences you did, what is the use of this? I don't think this is justified. I can't even understand what you are doing here. So a theory of justification is a theory of epistemology, and a theory of inference is a theory of logic, and so there will always be a distinction between these two. So you may always feel that there is some problem in the inference that is there. And I think this is the case with Russell, right? So Russell says that I understand 2 plus 2 is 4, but I'm not sure what justifies me in understanding this. So after writing Principia Mathematica, I don't know whether Russell felt that he was justified, but yeah, at least he felt that he had inferred that 2 plus 2 is 4. I'm not sure whether he felt he was justified because there are so many complex assumptions he has to make. So yeah, inference and justification not the same thing. There is a kind of Achilles and the tortoise difference between them. So justification is always running behind inference, and inference is always a little bit ahead. But justification can never catch up. So that's the whole problem with epistemology. I mean, they're very doubtful and skeptical kind of people about everything.
Professor Jung would like to ask something.
No, sir. Thank you so much. I'm happy listening.
Jada Sardar?